the current conflict with Ukraine and Russia. I mean, there's a lot of drones being flown out there. I'm not the expert on this. I only have a couple people on the ground. Patrick Lancaster is one of them. I'm not sure if you heard of him. We get some great insights by people like Brian Berletic, as well as the Duran that cover this. But besides these gentlemen and yourself, and a couple of other great independent freelance journalists out there, we don't know really what's going on in that war field. In fact, the question that I have, and what everyone has, is what is that body count in that part of the world? You cannot find it anywhere. And I mean, this has gone on for 18 months. How bad is it out there? As you said, humans, they want to survive, but I mean, these are nations that are locked into quite a battle here. And I haven't had anyone to date, give me even an estimate, because, we're trying to rely on the press, which we can't. We know that. And then to try to get the proper information out of these areas, well, who can we rely on, right? So we're all the way down to independent crowdfunded journalists that at least give us an insight. And I mean, you've been in the trenches, you've been in these types of conflicts before. You kind of have an idea of what both sides, and I'm going to focus now on the current conflict right now. You have an idea of both sides, what they have for artillery, what they have for missiles, warheads, tanks, whatever. Is there a reason why we're not getting a body count out of Ukraine?
Well, the reason why the reason why we're not getting a body count out of Ukraine is that the body count would be shocking and politically unsustainable for the Ukrainians from a domestic perspective, and it would create horror in the and hopefully horror in the populations of the Western nations supplying Ukraine, because ostensibly we're supposed to be Ukraine's friends. That means that what we're doing is supposed to be trying to promote the survival of Ukraine and the work to the benefit of the Ukrainian people. But if the truth comes out that this war has probably to date killed 340,000+ Ukrainian soldiers, probably somewhere in the area of 20 to 30,000 Ukrainian civilians. And let me just touch on that for a second, because we go, oh my God, that's like war crime stuff. I don't think most people understand that in most modern conflicts, and this is a modern conflict, the ratio of combatants to civilian deaths is roughly 1-to-1. To give you an example, the Normandy campaign, we lost roughly between us and the Germans, we lost roughly 60,000 guys in the Normandy campaign. 60,000 French civilians lost their lives as well. Most of them at the hands of the Allies, who blew up their towns, blew up their cities in an effort to drive out the Germans. We don't reflect on that. We killed 60,000 French civilians to liberate Normandy. That's just the way war is. So when you take a look at the amount of death that's taken place, because if you take the 340,000+ Ukrainian dead and you add on to that probably something that's approaching 40 to 50,000 Russian dead, we're talking 400,000 dead combatants. And if we're speaking of 40,000 dead civilians, that's a 10-to-1 ratio. So the next time people start talking about war crimes against civilians, and I'm not saying they didn't happen, they're not happening. Understand that the Russians aren't out to bring harm to the civilian population of Ukraine. If they were, there'd be a lot more dead civilians. But they're not. They're deliberately avoiding places where civilians are. Most of the civilian deaths occur because the Ukrainians have put their weaponry, have dug in their positions into civilian areas, which is a war crime. And don't take my word for it. Those well-known pro-Russian outlets, the Washington Post and Human Rights Watch, and I'm being facetious here, they've all come out and just said it. They've said Ukrainians are digging in around civilian places. It's a war crime. And it is. And that's why the vast majority of the civilians are dying, because the Ukrainians have turned what should be civilian areas into legitimate military targets by putting military equipment there. But so this war is going on. How do we calculate losses? First, I mean, there's a number of ways. One of the ways that's out there is to I don't want to bore people with the details, but there's ways to look into soldiers that aren't going home. I mean, the Ukrainians provide certain casualties. The mothers and the wives and the relatives of soldiers in Ukraine are filing reports to the Ukrainian government saying, "Where's my husband? He disappeared last year. You took him. Haven't gotten a letter from him. Haven't got anything." And these numbers get up into 300 plus thousand. Then you just do the hard calculation of war, probability of kill factors, how much ammunition is being fired on a given area, the concentration of troops there, the nature of the terrain, etc. And if you've done it I was in the field artillery for a couple of years, and I have gotten pretty good at sort of just doing rough calculations in my head. And when the Russians have a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to 1 advantage in artillery and are putting out that much lethality into a given area, you can start running PK factors. And I think, and here's the other thing too. Even the Ukrainians are starting to come out with a count. I think there's talk now that the Ukrainians are admitting to around 240,000 dead. People are going to say, "Well, Scott, that ain't 340,000."
Scott, where are they putting these bodies?
Well, the bodies are being buried in the ground. I mean, there's huge cemeteries as you drive in. People who come into Ukraine, as they come in, they're just saying, literally, it's like crops. The cemeteries are just all over the place. But here's the thing. The Russians now are starting to recapture positions that have been in the gray zone. You remember the Ukrainians launched that counteroffensive back in September, October of last year that took over areas in Kharkov, over the right bank of Kherson. In the Kharkov area, the Russians are starting to counterattack and push the Ukrainians out of areas that they had been occupied, or areas that were in the gray zone, the no man's land between the two. And what they're finding is Ukrainians just abandoned the dead. They're literally coming into an area and they're looking down and there's decomposed bodies all over the place. I mean, literally blanketing the ground. And these are bodies that haven't been buried. They're not counted. They're just there. There's 60 to 80,000 missing Ukrainians, missing. And we now have a good idea where there are. So when you take the whispers coming from the Ukrainian government, around 240,000 dead, and then you add on to that 60 to 80,000 missing, the vast majority of whom are dead, you get up into 340, 350,000
dead. And injured? What would we tally on injured? I know we don't.
Well, here's the thing.
Too long, but it's
normally you're looking at a 2 to 3 to 1 wounded to dead ratio normally, but the fact of the matter is the Ukrainians aren't in control of the battle space. What I mean by that, for instance, if I'm leading a Marine unit and we get ambushed, Staff Sergeant Schmuckatelli goes down, we're going to go in there, corpsman up. We're going to get that body taken care of. We got the golden hour. We're all trained for that. We're going to evacuate that body, that wounded man, out, get him to a medical facility where they're going to try and put life-saving care on him. And we saw this. One of the reasons why our death rate, the death statistics in Afghanistan and Iraq are relatively low for us is that we were very good at removing people that should have died and getting them out and getting them the care so that they live. Ukrainians don't have that. They don't have that luxury. First of all, they lose control of the battle space. When they put a company up and you suddenly have 2,000 rounds of artillery hit on you, a company no longer exists. There's nobody to evacuate them because everybody's dead. The bodies remain where they are. And oftentimes, and you see this with the tragic drone footage, the Russians will hit them. The surviving Ukrainians run away, abandoning their wounded who are sitting there on the ground in their death throes. These are people that, if they had been evacuated, probably could have been saved, but as a result are left to bleed out on the ground. And that's why I think that what we're talking about with the Ukrainians is probably closer to a 2 to 1 wounded to dead. So when we say 350,000 dead Ukrainians, we're talking 700,000 wounded Ukrainians. But it's not just that. Let's just not talk about the physical wounds, because what's happening now in Ukraine is the PTSD. See, people don't like to talk about it. It's sort of the unspoken reality of war. But war, and I'll just say this straight up. Anybody who's been to war is forever changed, forever changed. You're not the same person going out that you were going in. Now, that's just a statement of fact because you've seen things and you can't unsee them. And if you're a human being, what you've seen is disturbing. So you're dealing with that the rest of your life. But most people have coping mechanisms, and they have support networks, and they can get on and they can adjust and they can move forward, and they can do okay. They can do okay. But there's some people that can't for whatever reason. They come back, whatever they saw set off something that they can't get their hands around. They don't have a support network. They feel uncomfortable talking about it. Maybe they were participating in something, etc. And they're fundamentally broken. These are people that are no longer productive to society. They aren't integrating into society. They're withdrawing. They tend to become drug addicts. They become alcoholics. They tend to have bad social skills. They beat girlfriends. They beat wives. And there's a lot of them out there. We don't like to talk about it. We put the support the troops sticker on the back of our cars, but we don't support the troops. We support the troops that are in the bars, and we say, hey, welcome back. Thank you for your service. How many guys did you kill? Things like that. But we don't. What about the guy who's up in his room crying himself to sleep every night over a bottle of whiskey, or trying to shoot himself up with heroin just so he could forget about what he saw? Who's there for them? Who's there for them? Go to the VA. Go to the VA and sit down and talk to these guys. And but nobody wants to do it because it's uncomfortable, because it brings up the uncomfortable reality that we're responsible for that. We sent them to war. We, America, sent them to war, and now they're broken, and they're back here, and we don't want to deal with that. And Ukraine has this problem, an overwhelming problem. They have close to 1 million guys with PTSD right now. And these are guys that are no good to Ukrainian society anymore. In Ukraine, now, because they're at war, they lack the social services skill. These are forgotten people. So Ukraine right now has 1 million guys running around wild-eyed, 1,000-mile stare, finding drugs, not coping well, robbing, stealing, raping, murdering. That's what war does to societies. People need to understand that. Every time I get so angry at these people that put the Ukrainian flags in front of their house. Because I say, you are not a friend of Ukraine. You are not a friend of Ukraine, because no friend would allow this to happen to their friend. Just like I get mad at the people that put the support troops on their car.
Scott, this is the most engaged my audience has ever been on this program, and the questions that are coming in are just flying into our feed here. Bear with me while I pull a couple of the ones out. And once again, I really appreciate you taking the time to actually talk to people about this. No one is really talking about this. You are a voice that is needed, and I commend you for all the time that you've put in to try to tell people the reality of what is really happening across the world here. What are these governments doing? The responsibility for people. I do also commend you for your last comment. When people put up these symbolic things, they don't really even understand what they're rallying behind or who they're rallying behind. Another question that came in here was, we've talked about the deceased. We've talked about the injured. Someone brought up a comment, prisoners of war, how many are there? And that is a very interesting question. Maybe you can give us your insight on that. And once again, I really appreciate you being on this program, because our community here is really sitting back and paying attention. This, as I told you, this is one of the most engaged, and I can see by our analytics, 4-to-1 ratio of people that are really paying attention to what you're saying tonight. So once again, I'll hand it back over to you, Scott. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Prisoners of war are a reality of every conflict. And there are prisoners of war here. The Russians have taken tens of thousands of Ukrainians prisoner, and the Ukrainians have taken, I'm not going to say tens of thousands, but thousands of Russians prisoners. There is an active exchange program. One of the reasons is that the Ukrainians treat Russian prisoners of war horrifically. I think people need to understand that there is a racist element to Ukrainian nationalism, where they view Russians as subhumans. They call them orcs. They have other names for them that are vile. And so when they capture these Russians, they abuse them. They beat them. They cripple them. The video of them kneecapping the Russians is out there, and they murder them. They just execute them. And the Russians that are, and Ukrainian care are just abused every day. And so it is the goal of the I see TH's comment, and I'm glad you got treatment. I wish more people would get treatment, because you're right. You would have been dead long before now. And there's a lot of guys committing suicide today that need help and would be alive if they got the help they need. But I digressed. The Russian government has made it a priority to get the Russian prisoners of war home. And so if you take a look at, usually they try to do a roughly equal exchange, but on some occasions the Russians give away more prisoners than they receive. But the reason is that the prisoners that they receive are people that, if they didn't get repatriated soon, would die. They're malnourished, they're abused, they've been tortured, and the Russians just want to get these guys home and get them back to their families and get them the help they need. And so that's the reality. The Ukrainians are briefed. I mean, it's coming out now that in their training that they get, they're briefed that the Russians don't take prisoners, that the Russians will torture them, will kill them. And you see the videos of the Ukrainians being captured, and they're just like, please don't shoot me, please don't shoot me, please don't. And the Russians are like, we're not going to shoot you. Just, calm down. And then they go back and, they're now, some people say, well, that's just Russian propaganda, Scott. Maybe it is. I mean, I was trained in the art of taking prisoners and processing prisoners and interrogating prisoners, and I think I have a good eye for what's going on, and I don't see the Russians abusing these things. Could you find an example where some Russians did something bad? Of course you can. Again, I don't like to point to movies, but sometimes movies are the only thing people understand. Go to Saving Private Ryan and go to the assault on the Normandy beach, and you have the scene after the Americans have broken through after being slaughtered on the beach and seeing people die. They break through, and Germans are coming out with their hands up. And actually, they were Czechs in the movie saying, "Don't shoot us, we're not German." And the guys are like, "Yeah, pop, pop." They killed them anyways because they just don't care at that point in time. They don't view the people in front of them as human beings, and they just are they don't have time for this. Could the Russians be guilty of this? Yeah, of course. I'm absolutely positive. There's circumstances in there where where Russian troops have murdered Ukrainians, but it's not systemic. The Russians actually are bending over, because here's the difference, and this is the mindset. The Russians view the Ukrainians as brothers, as cousins, as fellow Slavs. And so when the Ukrainians surrender, it's the Russians like bringing the prodigal son home. Come back, son, come back. Let me take care of you. Ukrainians who are wounded get life-saving treatment from the Russians. The Russians evacuate them, save their lives, and all this stuff. And it's just a difference in the mindset. Now, there's Ukrainian nationalists out there. If the Russians find a Nazi symbol on your body, tattooed on your body, these guys live, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend that the Russians don't rough them up. I mean, I'm almost positive that the Russians give them a rifle butt to the face and kick them, and things you're not supposed to do by law. But, Russia is Soviet's a place that lost 27 million people to Nazi Germany. There's not a family out there that didn't lose somebody. My wife's father, my wife's from Georgia, Republic of Georgia, and her father lived with us. He was a refugee from a conflict in Georgia, but lived with us up until his death in 2019. He left behind a memoir, a handwritten memoir that we're now we found, and we're translating. We're trying to try and publish it. But in reading it, we found out a whole bunch of interesting things, such as my wife's family lost 5 people in World War II, dead, combat on the field. 3 of them were 18 years old. The other was in his 20s. The other was in his 30s. But just my wife's family, small family from the Republic of Georgia, lost 5 people in World War II. Every Russian family, every family in the Soviet Union lost people. 27 million died. And that weighs heavily on them. And so, some people don't understand the emotion behind the Russian commitment to this fight. A lot of Russia, I just came back from a trip to Russia. I spent 26 days in Russia in May, traveling to 12 cities, meeting them, talking to them. And they speak on. I mean, I think people have a misperception about Russians. They're a bunch of robotic people that just sit there and go, Vladimir Putin is great. Vladimir Putin is great. I can't say anything wrong because the secret police will kick it. No, man. These people are there. They talk openly, and they will all say, most of them say, when Putin ordered the troops in initially, they were against this war. They're like, we don't understand what you're doing. We don't know why you're doing this. What's going on? We're a little afraid about sanctions. We're nervous and all this stuff. That's gone today. That's gone because Russia has rallied behind the Russian government. The Russian people have, because this is about an existential struggle for survival of Russia. And the Ukrainian government has been exposed as a government that supports neo-Nazi ideology. They openly embrace a Ukrainian nationalist named Stepan Bandera, who was a murderous thug responsible for the deaths of 40,000 Jews. Babi Yar is a name that people should know. It's a place in Kiev where tens of thousands of Jews were taken and shot and gunned down, overseen by the Nazi Germans. But the people who pulled the trigger were the Banderists of Stepan Bandera, who murdered the Jews because that's what they do. And they killed 110,000. We just had the 80th anniversary of the Volyn massacre in Poland, where the Banderists slaughtered 110,000 Polish civilians, primarily women and children, gutting them, butchering them, putting them into buildings, setting the buildings on fire, getting drunk and laughing as they screamed inside. This is the hero of Ukraine. And the Ukrainian forces today, when they graduate from their camps, they sing songs praising Stepan Bandera. The general in command of the Ukrainian army has a portrait of Stepan Bandera behind his head. And it's not just in Ukraine, ladies and gentlemen. The Ukrainian diaspora, remember I said about the CIA taking over and controlling this. The CIA directed the Banderists on the ground in Ukraine from 1945 until 1953, carrying out a war against Soviet authorities. And you say, well, Scott, war, what? One guy here, a police guy killed here. 48,000 Russian soldiers lost their lives in that period of time. 48,000. 150,000 Ukrainian nationalist fighters lost their lives. 200,000 Russian civilians lost their lives. This was a major conflict funded and organized by the CIA against Russia. And those people that survived that, those nationalists, those pro-Hitler thugs, they fled. 150,000 of them fled, and they came to places like Canada, Great Britain, Australia, the United States. 60 miles away from there in Ellenville, New York, is a camp. They have a park called Heroes Park. They have 5 statues of Nazi Ukrainians, including Stepan Bandera. And every summer they hold children's festivals where the children come in and dress up in Nazi costumes, holding the portrait of Stepan Bandera, singing his praises. The Russians know what evil is, and they know where evil resides, and that's in Ukraine right now.
Well, Scott, I mean, we've seen what NATO is capable of right now. Some would say, well, not much, but my concerns is this going to spread? I mean, you have neocons, Lindsey Graham, for an example. This guy has a major need for world destruction. And he's got power. He's in the Senate. He's the guy that can pass these laws, these bills, these emergency, declarations. If you have a Republican on side with a Democrat, and both of them are, warmongers, and they want nothing but total world domination, and then you throw in not just, this current conflict, but we see other conflicts potentially heating up. I mean, is this going to be what brings NATO down, or is NATO using this current conflict as an excuse to continue to expand other places in this world? Maybe you can give me your overview, maybe a little bit of geopolitics here from a global scale on where you think NATO and the collective West is really going with all this.
Well, the short answer to your question, because you asked 2 questions, is this going to bring NATO down? Yes. But is NATO going to use this to try and expand its position globally, regionally? The answer is yes. And we see that right now. They had a recent summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. And out of that summit, we see NATO pushing a 4,000-page war plan, 4,000-page war plan against Russia. They're just straight up saying, we're getting ready for war against Russia. The mobilization of a 300,000 strong rapid deployment force. I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh about that, except that there's currently a 40,000 strong rapid deployment force for NATO, and they're bragging about how good that is. But I always challenge NATO, how rapid can you deploy it? Because you haven't. And I will tell you that they can't, because there's nothing rapid about it. It exists on paper only. You might get a few thousand people together, but there's no cohesive force. It doesn't train together. And I'm telling you right now, in war, if you don't train to fight, you ain't going to fight. You're just going to die. You have to train like you're going to fight, because that's the muscle memory you're going to fall back on when war happens. And when war happens, the brain shuts off and you just go off of what you've been trained to do. It's unthinking. You just move forward, you do it. And if you're people coming in that you've never trained with the guy on your left and your right and all this stuff, shells start coming down, people are going to start running, people are going to start dying. That's the end of it. That's NATO in a nutshell right now. They've spent the last 20 years working with the United States in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, where I don't mean to be too callous here, but I mean, we specialized in blowing up wedding parties. We specialized in kicking down the doors of innocent civilians and terrorizing them. Yeah, there's some bad guys out there we fought too, but this is NATO. This is the United States, and we're putting the hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars of defense capability up against tribesmen, villagers. And we lost in both cases. I just want to point that one out. We lost. The Taliban beat us. But we spent all our time doing that. What we weren't doing is training to fight large-scale ground combat in Europe. When I joined the Marine Corps, I said early on that I spent every day learning how to fight the Russians. That's literally the truth. I came into the unit. We were doing Vietnam War era artillery tactic. Basically, artillery sort of dug in on a straight line. We're doing a pre-planned schedule of fires. Everything works great because that's how you do it. Well, not against the Soviets, because they have artillery supremacy. And they come in, if we're just sitting there as a target, they'll blow us up, they'll kill us. We had to learn to be mobile, to be flexible, maneuver warfare, combined arms warfare, how to take maneuver combined with supporting arms and use intelligence and come up with a way to defeat the enemy in a fluid battle. For 2.5 years, my battalion practiced this. And I could say that when I left in 2.5 years, we were good at it. We could do it. But it was only because we spent every waking day in the field training. And I'm not talking about a little bit of training. I'm talking about full-scale live fire training. My battalion fired more artillery rounds in a year than the Marine Corps today fires in a year. One battalion fired more artillery rounds in a year of training than the Marine Corps fires the entire Marine Corps in a year today. That's how expensive this kind of training is. Stoltenberg's talking about making a 300,000 strong unit. Where are they going to get the money? This is the end of NATO. NATO simply cannot afford to do this. It's the end of NATO. They've bitten off more than they could chew. General Cavoli is the commanding general of Supreme Allied Commander, head of all American forces, Christopher Cavoli. He spoke in Sweden in January of this year at a Swedish Defense Forum, trying to welcome them in. But he talked about the war in Ukraine. And he said a number of things. But one of the things he said is that the scope and scale of the violence that's taking place on the ground in Ukraine is beyond the imagination of NATO. Now think about that for a second, because if it's beyond the imagination, that means you haven't considered it. And the military is all about what you've considered. What is a contingency plan? A contingency plan is we are looking at the possibility of where we're going to get involved. That means we have to study who we're going to be fighting, what their capabilities are, and what we have to bring to the battlefield to defeat them. How long is this fight going to take? How much fuel are we going to need? How much ammunition are we going to need? How much ammunition are we going to need? How many troops are we going to need? What about the other logistics supplies, the beans, the Band-Aids? How are we going to get all that in there? That's all planned up. And NATO has to conceive it. They haven't conceived the level of fighting taking place in Ukraine today. It's an artillery-driven war. To give you an example, the Gulf War, the one that I fought in, we fired 60,000 rounds for the entire conflict. 60,000. There are days when the Russians fire 60,000 rounds in one day. In one day. We have no clue what we're getting into. The Ukrainians are pumping out 5,000 to 7,000 rounds a day. We make 75,000 rounds a year. Now, I'm a simple Marine. I'm not that good at math. If it doesn't work on these fingers, I don't get it, but I can go, 5,000, 10,000, 15. And eventually, with a handful of figures, I've caught up to 75,000, and I'm only 2 weeks into the year. And there's 52 weeks in a year, and suddenly we're out of ammo for the best. That's the reality of it. NATO can't fight this fight. And NATO right now, the Western economies aren't getting ready to fight this fight. Why? Look at the Russians. To give you an example, when the Russians started this conflict, they had something called the Lancet. It's a drone. You spoke about drones earlier.
Right.
I was saying something about drones. First of all, drones, humans control them. We build them, we launch them, we direct them, and they do what we want. They collect the intelligence we want. They hit the targets we want. Sometimes we build in sort of an autonomy on these, meaning that because of given the nature of modern warfare, if I launch a drone and the enemy cuts off my communications to the drone is dead. It's gone. It's finished. So what I want to do is launch the drone and then cease communicating with the drone. I've sent it out. It's doing autonomous work. It's basically flying around looking for a target that's pre-programmed in. They'll find the target, assess, and then go in and attack. These are suicide drones, kamikaze drones. They'll do it, or they'll collect intelligence, and then after a certain period of time over target, they're going to automatically return to where I am, where I'm waiting to collect them and get the intelligence out of it. But the Lancet drone is a loiter drone. This is a drone that takes off, and it finds targets. It can be controlled on the ground or can be controlled autonomously. The Russians had a handful of these things. They were wonderful from the Russian perspective, bad for the Ukrainians. They launch and they take out tanks, they take out artillery, they take out command and control, but the Russians didn't have that many of them. They used them and they're gone. And the Russian troops are like, we need more Lancets. We need more Lancets. Well, you know what? The Russians are mass producing the Lancet, not just the original Lancet. They're into the 5th generation Lancet, because as the war is going on, the Russians are learning more about how they need to employ drones, what kind of communications they need, what the enemy's doing, etc. And they're incorporating that all into the Lancet. Right now, the Lancet's being produced at 200,000 a year. They're getting ready to gear it up so that it's millions a year. And here's the scary part. They're going to use the Lancets in what they call the swarm of drones, meaning you're basically going to take the Lancets and you're going to line up 150 of them and off they go. And they're all going to go stupid in terms of communicating back to me, but they're going to communicate with each other. Short-term communications can't be jammed. They're going to come in and they're going to talk, and then they're all going to come in at the same time and take out an entire area. The Russians got this drone thing down. They're doing good. They mass produce, and they're building or repairing more than 120 tanks a month. NATO right now is talking about it's going to take years to get 50 built up, et cetera, and they've already built them. The Russians are building